Dr. Night Echoes.
My dad worked in construction, and when I was a kid, he took me to an abandoned school his company was going to tear down. It was a massive brick building that felt like a giant sleeping beast. The air inside was cold and smelled like old paper and sour milk. Most of the windows were boarded up, so we had to use heavy flashlights to see where we were walking. Our boots made a loud, hollow, thudding sound on the linoleum floors. We reached the main hallway where the gymnasium used to be. A long glass trophy case was built into the wall. Most of the glass was cracked, and the silver trophies were covered in a thick layer of gray dust. But one section of the case had been wiped perfectly clean. I could see my own reflection in the glass, and it made me feel like someone was standing right behind me. Inside that clean section of the case, someone had drawn a perfect pentagram using thick black grease. In the very center of the star sat a crow. Its feathers were shiny and black, but its head was missing. The neck was a jagged, raw stump that looked like it had been twisted off by hand. The blood wasn't dry yet. It was still a deep, wet crimson that was slowly soaking into the velvet lining of the trophy shelf. Around the bird, 7 tall white candles were standing in a perfect circle. They were unlit, but the wicks were charred and black. The air inside the case didn't smell like old trophies anymore. It smelled like raw meat and burnt hair. My dad gripped my shoulder so hard it hurt. He didn't say a word, but he turned me around and marched me straight toward the exit. He never took me back to that site again.
My house was built in the early 1900s, and the floors always felt a little uneven. Last month, a pipe burst in the crawl space, so I had to crawl under the foundation with a headlamp to fix it. The space was tight and smelled like damp earth and old rot. I started digging through the loose dirt to reach the plumbing, but my shovel hit something hard. It didn't sound like a rock. It sounded like hollow wood. I brushed the dirt away and saw a massive, white curve sticking out of the ground. It was a rib, but it was far too large for a deer or a dog. I kept digging, my heart thumping against the floor joists above me. I uncovered a leg bone the size of my arm, then another. After an hour of frantic scraping, I realized I was looking at a complete, intact skeleton of a Percheron horse. The skull was the worst part. It was tucked right under the main bedroom, facing upward toward the floorboards. The empty eye sockets were huge, filled with black dirt. The jaw was slightly open, showing massive yellowed teeth. It wasn't just tossed into a hole. It was laid out perfectly, like it was sleeping right beneath where I slept every night. A horse that size weighs a ton. You don't just accidentally bury a giant workhorse under a house. The previous owners would have had to dig the pit before the foundation was even poured. They wanted it there. I crawled back out into the sunlight, shaking the graveyard dirt off my clothes. Now, every time the house creaks at night, I don't think it's the wood settling. I think about those massive, heavy bones shifting in the dark, right under my bed. My friends and I found a heavy concrete staircase that seemed to lead straight into the dirt. We were high and looking for a thrill, so we followed it down. The air turned thick with the smell of wet chalk. At the bottom, a long hallway opened up. It looked like something out of a low-budget sci-fi movie. There were rows of small concrete cubes that looked like prison cells. Most of the heavy metal doors had been kicked in years ago. Each room was painted a different, jarring color. Some had zebra stripes,
while others were covered in messy splotches of neon paint that had faded into a sickly mold. Most of the cells were filled with old beer bottles and flattened cigarette butts from other kids who had been down there. But one door at the very end was still locked tight. It was the only one that hadn't been forced open yet. I leaned against the small, smashed-out window of that door to look inside. The walls were covered in a weird, vertical stripe pattern. It was a dizzying mix of colors that made my head swim. A rusted metal cot sat in the center with a mattress that was soaked in a dark, brownish stain. But it was the walls that made my stomach drop. The paint was shredded. Thousands of deep, narrow gouges were carved into the concrete, stripping the colorful layers away. In some spots, the scratches were so deep they had reached the gray stone underneath. It wasn't done with a tool. The marks were thin and jagged, exactly the width of a human fingertip. I stared at the flecks of dried paint on the floor and realized the person inside had spent every waking second trying to claw their way through the colors with their bare hands. I couldn't stop looking at my own fingernails the whole way home. The antique store in the center of town was a tomb for the 1960s. It was built inside the shell of an old department store, and the air always smelled like lemon polish and stale perfume. Most people stayed in the front, where the sun hit the windows, but I liked to wander. One afternoon, I pushed on a heavy wooden door in the back that I thought led to a restroom. Instead, it opened into a narrow, windowless hallway. The carpet was a thick, mustard yellow shag that muffled every sound of the modern world outside. I followed the hall until it hit a grand, sweeping staircase. I climbed the steps, and when I reached the top, my breath caught in my throat. It was a perfectly preserved showroom from 60 years ago. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their glass droplets clicking together in a draft I couldn't feel. The furniture was all low-slung velvet sofas and glass coffee tables, arranged like a family had just stepped out for a moment. But the essence of the room was wrong. It felt heavy, like the air was pressing against my skin. I walked toward the far corner, my footsteps sinking deep into the carpet. Tucked away near a marble pillar, I saw a small, faded square on the floor. I knelt down to look closer. It was a package of condoms, the cardboard yellowed and brittle with age. The brand name was one I didn't recognize, and the price tag was marked in cents. It looked like it had been sitting there for 50 years, untouched by a single vacuum or footstep. I looked back at the empty, sparkling room and realized the chandeliers were swaying faster now. The tinkling of the glass sounded like a quiet, high-pitched laugh. I didn't wait to see if the owners of that room were coming back. I ran down the stairs and didn't stop until I hit the street.
Last summer, I decided to rip out the drywall in the back bedroom of my new house. The previous owners had left the place in a mess, and I could smell something stale trapped behind the wood. As the first slab of plaster crumbled, a pile of dry, gray debris fell onto my boots. I reached into the hollow space between the studs, my fingers brushing against something cold and papery. I pulled out a small, tattered book with a faded red cover. The title was Sex Games People Play. The pages were swollen from moisture, and the ink had bled into dark, messy streaks. Tucked behind the book were two black and white photographs. They showed massive, prize-winning cows standing in a field. The animals looked unnaturally large,
their eyes wide and glassy in the old flash. Right next to the photos, I found a tight, dense ball of hair. It wasn't animal fur. It was long, coarse, and a dull brown color, matted together with dried mud. It felt heavy in my hand, like it had been compressed for decades. A handful of black bird feathers were stuck to the hairball, looking like they had been plucked one by one. I shined my light further up into the wall and froze. A rat skeleton was fused to the wooden stud. It wasn't lying at the bottom, it was upright, its tiny rib cage pressed against the timber. Its front claws were dug deep into the grain, frozen in a frantic, scrambling position. It looked like it had been trying to climb out of the wall when the air ran out.
The strangeness didn't stop there. When I crawled under the porch to check the foundation, I found a mummified deer skull wedged into the corner. The skin was stretched tight over the bone like brown parchment. Next to it sat a heavy, dented cast iron skillet and a half-full bottle of bourbon. The liquid inside was dark and thick. It felt like someone had been living in the dirt, drinking and watching the house from below. I nailed the boards back over the porch that night and never went under there again. My friends and I used to drive out northwest of Los Angeles to hunt for the old missile silo. It was a well-known spot for explorers, hidden deep in the dry brush and hills. We finally found the entrance one night, a massive concrete hole that felt like it was sucking the heat out of the desert air. We climbed down the rusted ladders, our flashlights cutting through the thick, stagnant dust. It felt like walking into a giant, hollowed-out grave. We eventually reached the main launch chamber. It was a cavernous room where a nuclear missile would have sat decades ago. The scale of it was dizzying. My heart was thumping against my ribs as we panned our lights across the peeling gray paint. Then, the beam of my light hit the center of the floor. We all stopped dead. Right in the middle of that dead, empty space was a perfect circle of folding chairs. They were positioned neatly, all facing inward toward a single wooden table. On top of the table sat a lone white candle. The flame was steady and bright, casting long, dancing shadows against the curved concrete walls. It wasn't flickering. There was no wind down there, just the heavy, wet smell of melting wax and something else, like old copper. We stood there in total silence for a long minute, waiting for a floorboard to creak or a voice to call out. We hadn't seen a single car on the dirt road for miles. There was no sound of footsteps retreating into the dark tunnels. The candle was tall, like it had just been lit seconds before we stepped into the room. The wax was still liquid and clear at the base of the wick. We didn't say a word to each other. We just turned around and climbed back to the surface as fast as we could. I still wonder who was sitting in those chairs when they heard us coming. My girlfriend and I found an old gray house at the end of a dead-end street. Most people stayed away, but we liked exploring places like that. We pushed the front door open and headed straight for the attic. It was the only part of the house we hadn't seen yet. I expected dust and spider webs, but what we found was much worse. Someone was living there. The air didn't smell like an old house. It smelled like cheap cigarettes and old grease. There were fresh food wrappers and empty soda bottles scattered across the floor. A small wooden table sat near the window with a plate on it. There were still crumbs on the plate. In the corner, a massive pile of dirty magazines sat next to a stack of used condom wrappers. It made my skin crawl. A single mattress laid on the floor, but the blankets were pulled tight and neat. The fireplace had been swept clean,
and I could still see the faint glow of orange embers in the gray ash. Leaning right next to the door was a heavy metal baseball bat. It looked like it had been through a war. There was a jagged, fist-sized hole torn right through the middle of the metal. I have no idea how you could possibly rip a hole in a bat like that. It showed a dark, hollow inside that looked like a throat. I reached out to touch it, but then we both froze. We didn't say anything. A cell phone started to vibrate on a wooden bench just a few feet away. The low, rhythmic buzzing filled the silent room. The screen lit up the corner of the attic, but we didn't stay to see who was calling. We turned and sprinted down the stairs, nearly falling in our rush to get to the front door. We didn't stop until we reached the main road. My husband and I used to think that the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town was our private kingdom. We spent years there with our college friends, playing airsoft and running through the massive, hollowed-out rooms. It was the best place in the world for us. We knew every cracked floorboard and every rusted pillar. But everything changed one rainy Tuesday night when it was just the two of ours. We were sitting on a set of metal stairs in the middle of the main floor, just talking and making out. The sound of the rain hitting the corrugated tin roof was deafening. It created a steady, rhythmic drumming that usually felt relaxing. After a few minutes, the rhythm changed. It wasn't the rain anymore. I felt a slight vibration through the metal step under my legs. It was a heavy, deliberate thud, then another. They were footsteps, but they sounded wrong. They were too heavy for a person, like someone was dragging a weighted sack behind them with every step. The sound was coming from the farthest, darkest corner of the warehouse. My husband froze. He felt it too. We stayed perfectly still, hoping it was just the wind or a stray dog. The thuds got louder and faster. They were moving toward the stairs. My husband grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and clicked it on. He aimed the beam toward the darkness. The light cut through the dust, showing nothing but empty space and concrete. There was no one there, but the sound didn't stop. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer and closer, until they sounded like they were right at the base of our stairs. I could hear the grit on the floor crunching under an invisible weight. We didn't wait another second. We scrambled down the opposite side, nearly knocking each other over in a blind panic. We squeezed through a broken window and didn't stop running until we reached the car. We never went back. There is a drainage tunnel about 10 minutes from my house that I used to visit all the time. When I first started getting into photography, I thought the mossy concrete and the way the light hit the entrance looked artistic. Later on, my friends and I would head down there after a few drinks just to mess around and explore the dark. It was a normal spot for us until I started noticing the bucket. It is a rusted plastic pail tucked into a small alcove where the tunnel curves. The first time I saw it, it was filled to the brim with shredded fabric. I reached in and pulled out a strip of denim and a floral sleeve. They weren't just torn, they were cut into perfect, even squares. Buried in the middle were 3 leather belts that had been sliced into tiny segments, like a snake cut into pieces. I figured it was just some weird local art project or a homeless person's junk. I went back 2 weeks later to get some shots of the tunnel floor. The bucket was still there, but the denim was gone. Now it was packed with bright yellow polyester and scraps of a silk blouse. The pieces were still damp, and they smelled faintly of cheap laundry detergent and something metallic. A new set of thin, braided belts sat on top, each one hacked into 2-inch bits. Every time I go back now, the contents have changed. One day it's winter coats, the next it's summer dresses. It's always women's clothing, and it's always meticulously chopped into those same haunting squares. There are no footprints in the silt around the bucket, and I never hear anyone else in the tunnel. Someone is coming here in the dead of night just to sit in the dark and quietly slice through fabric over and over again. I stopped bringing my camera. I don't want to be there when the bucket is empty and they're waiting for something new to cut.